The protagonist forwards a PDF to herself at 11:40 on a Tuesday night. 3 lines of annotation. She doesn't know whether she will ever use it. She builds the record anyway. That single email is why everything else works. You're watching Eternal Diary. The morning they ended my career at Aldercroft, the building smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and something older underneath. That combination of antiseptic and paper that had been the specific smell of that hallway since the day I first interviewed here, 14 years ago. I was 29 then, nervous enough to have memorized 3 possible answers to every question they were likely to ask, and the smell had been so particular, so exactly itself, that I had filed it away as a good omen without entirely meaning to. I noticed it again on the way to Adrian's office, walking the same corridor with the same stride I had used for 11 years of teaching and 3 years of tenure. The carpet was still the same industrial gray. The light was doing the same thing it had always done in the morning. Flat, overexposed, or coming in at an angle from the east-facing windows at the end of the hall and making everything look like a photograph taken half a second too late. I was carrying coffee. The cup was still warm against my palm. Adrian Kessler's office was in the corner that caught the best light in the building, which he had arranged and which I had always noted as a minor, but telling detail about who he was. The room was comfortable without being personal, a department chair's office, staged to communicate authority and accessibility in equal measure. Books on the shelf he had not read, arranged spine out so the titles showed, plants that survived because his assistant watered them. A framed photograph of the university's founding cohort that every chair before him had also displayed, which made it less a personal choice than a structural requirement. Not that he stood when I came in. He did this when he thought the news he was delivering was worth standing for. I set my coffee cup on the edge of his desk and sat down in the chair across from him. I had been in this room enough times. Budget conversations, curriculum approvals, performance reviews, faculty dispute mediations, that sitting in that chair felt exactly the same as it had every other time. I was aware that it might be the last time. I noted the awareness and did nothing with it. "Corinna," he said, and settled back down, his hands resting on the desk in the steepled position he favored when he was trying to appear measured. "Thank you for coming in." He moved through the preamble efficiently. The university was navigating a period of financial realignment. The provost's office had identified areas for restructuring. Also, the Department of Historical Studies was among the units affected. A tenured line was being converted to a visiting position, which would allow for greater flexibility in research appointments and donor-funded collaborations. The word flexibility is institutional language for, we have promised someone something and we need to make room for it. As the most recently tenured faculty member, he said, you are the natural starting point for this conversation. He did not say, you are also the faculty member who came into this office 2 years ago and told me you had concerns about a junior colleague's scholarship, and I steepled my fingers at you and told you to be careful about the appearance of professional jealousy. He did not say, and you are the person whose expression when you left that meeting I have been trying to read ever since. "No, Delphine's appointment is already confirmed at the tenured level," he continued. "The Wyndham Foundation support is considerable. Her scholarly profile represents exactly the kind of—" "I understand," I said. He paused. He had expected something. A question, a protest, the particular quality of controlled devastation that makes administrators feel they have managed a situation rather than simply executed one. I gave him none of it. "Your publication record is genuinely exceptional," he said, moving into the compensatory register. "I want to be absolutely clear about that. This is a budgetary decision. I would be glad to write a thorough letter for any position you choose to pursue. The library's Special Collections Directorship will be advertising internally in the spring. And given your expertise in rare materials, that won't be necessary," I said. He stopped. "The letter," I clarified. "I already have what I need." I picked up my coffee cup. I stood. I walked to the door. "I'll have the office cleared by the end of the month," I said. I did not look back at him. I had considered, over several evenings in the preceding weeks, exactly how I wanted to be in that room when the thing happened. What I had settled on was this: quiet. No speech. Nothing he could file as a data point about how I had received it. In the hallway, the paper smell was still there underneath the antiseptic. I walked the full length of it. I was aware of the sound my shoes made on the industrial carpet. aware of the coffee cooling in my hand, aware that I had known this was coming for 3 months. Sword had made arrangements for 3 months and had still, somewhere underneath the arrangements, hoped for a different outcome. That is what hope does. It persists past usefulness. I opened my office door. I went inside. I closed it behind me. My office. I had occupied it for 11 years. The window faced east, and in winter caught the morning light at an angle I had never stopped finding beautiful. Flat and clear, landing on the book spines in a way that made them look slightly ceremonial. I had 70 linear feet of shelving filled in the specific order I had developed over a decade, by subject, then by date of acquisition, the journals arranged along the top shelf by color because there was no better system for them. My working drafts were in the file cabinet to the left of the desk, organized by project and date. Annotated in pencil because I have always thought most clearly in pencil. The desk itself was a standard institutional model I had supplemented with a wooden surface extension bought at an estate sale, making it wide enough to lay out a full manuscript page and a comparison document side by side. The lamp my mother had given me the day I received my tenure letter was in the corner. It was small and blue glazed, with a paper shade gone slightly amber over 3 years of light. She had found it at a flea market and said, "I know you're already celebrating, but I needed to do something with my hands." On the wall across from the window was a photograph of the Ghent altarpiece, which I had framed and hung the week I received my first Aldercroft paycheck. But the color was slightly warm in the reproduction. The original is not. But I had stood in front of the actual panels during my postdoctoral fellowship and felt something I had not been able to name precisely since, and I had wanted a way to carry it close without being sentimental. A framed photograph in an academic office is reference material. It is not sentiment. I sat in my chair. Then I pulled out the bottom drawer of my desk and looked at what was inside. The bound document was there. 70 pages, professionally printed and bound at a copy shop 8 blocks from campus on a Wednesday evening in November, when I had stayed in the building until 8 o'clock to make sure the hallways were quiet before I carried it out. The cover was blank. No title, no name. Just 70 pages of comparative annotation, sequentially numbered, all precisely sourced. I picked it up. I considered leaving it in the drawer. I had other copies. 4 copies, in fact, the bound document in my hands, a PDF in a cloud storage account on a server in Switzerland that I paid for out of personal funds, an encrypted folder on an external drive I kept in my apartment, and a certified mail envelope sent to my own home address on February 14th, which was sitting in my kitchen drawer, postmarked and sealed and unopened. 5 copies if you counted the working document on my personal laptop, but that was not the final version, and I was precise about these things. I did not need the bound copy. I should leave it. I put it in my bag. I started building the documentation in January. That needs a full account because the timing of it is everything. I am a professor of medieval manuscript studies. Auntie I had been one at Aldercroft for 11 years, tenured for 3 of those. The tenure had taken 9 years to earn, which is not unusual in a humanities subfield that places a high burden of evidence on its most original claims. What I am trained to do, technically, specifically, is look at texts and determine what is original and what is derivative. I authenticate manuscripts for a living. I establish intellectual genealogy. I read the traces that origin leaves in a document, whether the document intends to carry them or not. This is relevant to what happened with Delphine Cassel. She had arrived at Aldercroft on a visiting appointment funded by the Wyndham Foundation 8 months before Adrian's meeting. She was 31, had published 2 books that the field had read widely and praised substantially, and she moved through departmental spaces with the specific, practiced ease of someone who had thought carefully about the impression she made and arrived at a considered approach. She shook hands with a warm formality that suggested study. She made eye contact without holding it uncomfortably long. She asked questions about other people's work that were specific enough to communicate genuine attention. The first time we spoke, at the departmental gathering Adrian organized to welcome her, we talked for 8 minutes. She said she had read my 4th book, the one on authentication methodology, and found the chapter on palimpsest analysis particularly useful for her current project. She asked several intelligent questions about the archival work I was developing. I answered them. Us, we parted with the collegial warmth that is entirely real and entirely surface level simultaneously, which is the only warmth that functions at professional gatherings. I watched her cross the room toward Adrian and thought, she is very good at this. She was. The reading of rooms, the management of impression, the specific skill of making every person in a conversation feel accurately perceived. These were genuine abilities, developed with care. They had served her for a long time. What she also had was a 200-page monograph and a particular relationship to the unread work of a Belgian doctoral student who had gone to work in a museum. I want to be precise about how I discovered it, because precision is the point. Her second book, Les pratiques scripturales dans les ateliers du Nord, had been published 2 years before her arrival at Aldercroft by a major French academic press. It had made her name in the field. It was the reason the Wyndham Foundation had identified her, why they had funded the visiting appointment, why Adrian had been consistently enthusiastic about her scholarly profile in faculty meetings I attended, with my hands folded in my lap and my face arranged into an expression I have developed over years. Attentive without being reactive, engaged without being readable. I speak French. This is not remarkable in my field. Medieval manuscript studies requires reading ability in Latin at minimum, and usually several vernacular languages. French is foundational. But I had also spent 18 months in Ghent during my postdoctoral fellowship, working at a consortium library, and spending Saturdays at cafes on the canal reading everything I hadn't had time for during the research weeks. During those months, I had attended conferences in Brussels and Liège and Ghent, and through those conferences I had encountered the Manuscript Studies program at the Université de Liège, which produced careful, serious, well-sourced scholarship in a field that is often underfunded and underread. At one such conference, a doctoral student from Liège had presented part of her dissertation. Her name was Hélène Powels. She was small and direct, with a manner of thinking visibly before she spoke that made the speaking, when it came, unusually clean. Her argument was about scribal transmission in southern Netherlandish ateliers between 1250 and 1450. It was precise and original, and she had built it from the ground up from primary archival sources that I recognized and knew to be genuinely difficult. I had gone up after the session to tell her so. We exchanged contact information. We did not stay in close contact, which is the normal outcome of conferences when the lives in question are organized around different institutions and different timelines. Her thesis, Atelier, Scripts et Transmission Culturelle dans les Pays-Bas Méridionaux, 1250 to 1450, was completed in 2017. She had left academia shortly after, taking a curatorial position at a museum in Brussels. Her dissertation sat in the Université de Liège's public repository, accessible to anyone with an internet connection and enough French to read it. It had never been formally published. It had never been translated. And I had downloaded it during my postdoc, along with several other dissertations I was tracking. It had been sitting in my digital archive of postdoctoral materials for 15 years, last opened in 2011. I opened it again in January of this year, on a Sunday afternoon, because I had been reading Delphine's book for 3 days, and something was bothering me that I had not yet been able to name. The first time I noticed the resemblance, I thought I was being uncharitable. Scholars working in overlapping fields develop similar language. Certain formulations become standard. Certain analytical moves, once made by a prominent scholar, get adopted as the accepted way to frame a type of argument. I was aware that I had personal feelings about Delphine, not hostile feelings, but feelings. The specific professional wariness that develops when you watch an institution reorganize itself around someone new with particular institutional enthusiasm. I set the book aside. I came back to it the following Sunday. By the 3rd chapter, the sensation had become specific. It was not that the argument resembled Hélène's. It was that particular formulations, interpretive moves, the arrangement of evidence, the precise framing of a claim about how northern ateliers transmitted scribal practice across linguistic boundaries, were so close to passages in the Liège dissertation that the probability of independent convergence, as I calculated it, was not high. I got up from my reading chair. I went to the kitchen. I stood at the counter for a while. Then I came back and opened the Powell's thesis on my laptop. And I placed both documents side by side on the screen. I am trained in manuscript authentication. I have spent my career looking at texts with the specific and technical intention of determining what is original and what is derivative. The vocabulary of my field for this kind of analysis is precise: source relationship, dependency, priority, transmission. I applied that vocabulary to what I was reading, applying it as carefully as I would to a question of scholarly attribution in a 14th century archive. By the end of that Sunday afternoon, I had identified 11 specific instances where Delphine's book contained material that was, in my assessment, a translation and reformulation of original analytical argument from the Powell's thesis, unacknowledged. The reformulations were not identical. They had been processed. Or if run through different vocabulary, the French adjusted, the syntax rearranged. But the intellectual genealogy was readable to someone who had the original in front of them. The way a scribe's hand can be identified across multiple manuscripts by the specific formation of a particular letter, Helene's argument was identifiable across the different presentation Delphine had given it. The footnotes made it explicit. In 11 specific cases, Delphine's notes cited other scholars, prominent, frequently cited English language scholars, as the source of the ideas she was presenting. The citations were not wrong exactly. Those scholars had written about adjacent topics, but they were not the actual source of the specific argument Delphine was making in those passages. The actual source was Hélène Powell's, and unmentioned in the footnotes and absent from the bibliography. I opened a new document and began annotating. I worked with the dispassionate attention I bring to archival analysis. For each instance, the page and line from Delphine's book, the corresponding passage from the Powell's thesis, the specific nature of the intellectual dependency, the footnotes Delphine had used in place of the Powell's citation, a brief assessment of whether the resemblance was plausibly coincidental. I was precise. I was not emotional. I was building a record, not an argument, because the two things are different. An argument is addressed to someone specific, a record is addressed to the future. By the end of January, I had 32 pages of comparative documentation covering the second book alone. I thought about what to do with it. When I was 12 years old, my mother planted a garden in the backyard of our house. She spent a spring and a summer building it, working in the evenings after her second job, replacing the clay soil with something workable, installing drainage, choosing plants with the specific care she brought to everything she undertook. By the end of the summer, it was beginning to produce. By the following spring, the neighbor put up a fence and claimed a third of the plot was on his property line. My mother spent 3 months on the dispute. She had everything you could want: the property survey, receipts for materials, photographs taken at every stage of the garden's development. She won. The fence came down. But the garden was gone by then. The season was over. The neighbor had achieved exactly what he intended. Not the property, but the disruption, the exhaustion, the lost growing season. I thought about that garden every time I considered walking into Adrian's office with my documentation. If I had gone to Adrian, he would have processed my concern through the lens of what was useful to him. The useful interpretation was recently threatened faculty member generating a complaint about the person replacing her at the moment when a major donor commitment was being finalized. He would have been gracious. He would have said all the right things. He would have referred it to the research integrity process, with framing that guaranteed maximum duration. The investigation, if it proceeded, would have been managed with the institution's revenue in mind rather than the field's integrity. I would have won the property dispute and lost the garden. I also understood, by February, that I was going to be pushed out. The signs had been accumulating for months. Adrian's behavior in faculty meetings had shifted. He was avoiding my eye in the way that signals foreknowledge rather than discomfort. The Wyndham Foundation's visible investment in Delphine's public profile was extending from the academic into the institutional. The pieces were not subtle once I knew to read them. I was not going to be at Aldercroft much longer, so I kept building the file, and I began, quietly, to look for what came next. Let me be specific about the job search, because specificity is the whole point. I maintained a professional email address on a domain I had personally owned since 2015, unconnected to any institutional account. This was not unusual practice. Many academics do it for various reasons, but it had the specific advantage in this situation of keeping my external professional correspondence entirely outside Aldercroft systems. Everything I sent and received in that search was mine. I solicited letters of recommendation in February from 3 scholars outside Aldercroft. A colleague at the Haverstock Institute who had collaborated with me on a grant project 3 years earlier. A senior French scholar who had published a response to one of my articles. My own former doctoral supervisor, now at Edinburgh, who had stayed in genuine contact through the years. None of them were entangled in Aldercroft's politics. None of them knew what was developing at Aldercroft. They responded quickly, because my record was what it was. The Haverstock Institute for Advanced Study had advertised a research position in January. I had tracked Haverstock's postings for years. Not from dissatisfaction at Aldercroft, but because it was an institution that produced work I wanted to read and that organized around principles I found genuinely compelling. It was not a university in the traditional sense, it was a research institute affiliated with a consortium of European libraries, funded by foundation grants and member contributions, oriented entirely toward original manuscript research and collaborative digital archiving. No tenure committee politics, no curriculum politics, no donor hospitality events at which I was expected to appear enthusiastic. The salary was comparable to my current position. The work was entirely research. All of the structure was remote, first, with 2 international residencies per year at consortium libraries in Brussels, Edinburgh, and Leiden. I applied in February. I was shortlisted in March and had a series of conversations with the hiring committee. I was not asked to disclose what was happening at Aldercroft. I was not required to frame it. I described where I was and where I was going and what I was building, and the committee was interested in the work, as committees at research institutions tend to be. I was offered the position in early April. I accepted it on a Wednesday morning. The following Monday, Adrian called me in. The boxes were already assembled in my office when I came back from that meeting. I had brought them the Friday before. Packing was a specific kind of grief, quiet and physical. My books in the order I knew them, by subject, by acquisition date, by the associations each one carried, some of them since graduate school with the characteristic fading of volumes on shelves for 2 decades in rooms with varying light. My annotated copies, my working files, the correspondence folders, the collection of small objects accumulated on my desk over 11 years, a fragment of medieval wax seal from a flea market in Bruges, unattributed, probably not significant, but interesting in the hand. A river stone from the path near my parents' house, put in my pocket on a walk the day I submitted my tenure application. A ceramic pencil holder a graduate student had given me for my birthday 7 years ago, painted with a scene she told me was from a Flemish manuscript and which was, I determined later, nude from her own imagination of what a Flemish manuscript might contain, which I found more interesting than a direct copy would have been. The lamp from my mother, the photograph from Ghent, the documentation file from the bottom drawer went into my bag. I stood for a moment holding it in the middle of my office, considering leaving it. I had other copies. I didn't strictly need this one, but I had made it. I had built it with the specific patient care I bring to authenticating a manuscript, line by line, comparison by comparison, building an argument that could hold weight at the level of evidence. I was not going to leave it on a desk in a room that was no longer mine. I put it in the bag, I turned off the light, I closed the door behind me. Gideon found me in the hallway, carrying the first box toward the elevator. He was in the Department of Classical Studies, had been for 17 years, and had survived 3 department chairs with the equanimity of someone who had genuinely disengaged from institutional politics without becoming cynical, a specific and difficult balance that I had always respected in him. He carried a stack of student papers with the particular air of someone not entirely sure how they arrived in his arms. He looked at the box. "All ready?" he said. "Meeting was this morning," I said. "I have the office until the end of the month." "How bad?" "Budget restructuring, tenured line converted, Wyndham money, Delphine's appointment confirmed." He absorbed this with the still, careful quality he brought to everything he found genuinely wrong. Then, "Where are you going?" "Haverstock," I said. "Research position, remote, with residencies." He pushed his reading glasses from the top of his head to his nose and back. "Corinna, that's actually better." "I know. When did you—" "A few weeks ago. I wanted to be sure before I said anything." He understood this. He understood the specific discipline of not announcing your next move before it is fully arranged, particularly in environments where information circulates in ways that are not always to the advantage of the person it concerns. We stood in the hallway with the box between us. "Delphine," he said. Not a question. A subject he was approaching carefully. "Yes." "I've looked at her work," he said. "Properly?" He shifted the student papers. "She's brilliant. The synthesis is extraordinary." He stopped. "I just don't always recognize where the argument is coming from. It has a quality of it." "Yes," I said. Now he looked at me. "I noticed something similar," I said. "I've been documenting it. I'm not doing anything with it at the moment." "Why not?" "Because I don't need to. Not yet." He was quiet. The hallway was empty except for us. The east windows were doing the flat, overexposed thing. "You're waiting for the new book?" he said. "She's under contract." The Wyndham appointment came with an expectation of a manuscript. Adrian said she expects to deliver by spring. And if the same problems are in the new manuscript, then the peer review process involves international scholars, I said. And I don't have to do anything. The material makes its own case. And if she doesn't deliver it? If she figures out the exposure and walks away from the contract? Then I reevaluate. But I don't think that will happen. She doesn't know what I know. And the confidence of someone who has never been caught is a specific thing. It runs deep. Gideon nodded slowly. He looked at the box in my arms and at the office door behind me with the light off and the room visible through the glass panel, beginning to look like what it was becoming. "Keep yourself entirely out of it," he said. "Whatever you do with what you have, keep your hands clean." "That's the plan," I said. I carried the first box to my car. I went back for the second. By the end of the afternoon, 11 years of an office were in cardboard boxes in my back seat, and my car smelled like book dust and the particular warm paper smell of a room where serious work has been stored for a long time. I drove home and made dinner and ate it at my kitchen table next to the drawer containing the unopened certified mail envelope. And so I was aware of its presence the way you are sometimes aware of a specific object in a room, not supernaturally, just the consciousness of something simultaneously ordinary and specifically significant. I did not open it. It was not meant to be opened. I emailed Haverstock to confirm my acceptance was final. I organized the boxes in my study. I put the lamp on the desk. I hung the altarpiece photograph on the wall above it. I went to bed and slept better than I had in 3 months. I want to describe Delphine accurately because the easy version of this story makes her flat. And she was not flat. She was genuinely intelligent, real analytical ability, a gift for synthesis, adult in a different version of her history, one in which she had trusted that ability instead of scaffolding it with borrowed labor. She might have produced the same work honestly. She hadn't, but the intelligence was real. What she lacked, as far as I can determine from the outside, was patience. Scholarship is unreasonably slow. You can spend 3 years establishing a single interpretive claim. You can produce a book that changes how a small but significant field understands a set of texts, and the people who notice will number in the hundreds, and the people who cite you will number in the dozens, and your salary will be adequate, and your office will be small. The ratio of work to recognition is brutal. I had made my peace with it during my postdoc and never renegotiated. Not everyone does. Delphine had, I think. I decided somewhere along the way that the ratio was wrong and that she was going to correct it by other means. She was good enough to understand what the best work in the field looked like. She was ambitious enough to want to produce it. She was not patient enough to do what the work actually required. And somewhere in her training, she had found a shortcut. The shortcut had worked, and so she had taken it again, further with more confidence until it was not a shortcut anymore but the entire road. The confidence of that. I had thought about it a great deal. She had relied on the invisibility of her sources. A Belgian dissertation in French by a scholar who had left the field, published only in a university repository, never translated, read by almost no one in the English language scholarly mainstream. Invisible. Or so the calculation went. What she had not accounted for was the one person in her new institution who had specific language skills, specific archival memory, and the particular coincidence of having downloaded that exact dissertation 15 years earlier and still having it time-stamped and cross-referenced in a personal archive. I had not been in the calculation. I finished out the semester. My graduate students were handled with the care they deserved. Their projects were my responsibility regardless of what was happening institutionally, and I met that responsibility. I attended the final required faculty meeting of the year and sat in the usual seat and wore the usual expression. I submitted grades on time. I completed all administrative requirements. On my last official day, I went to Gideon's office. Oh, he made tea in the electric kettle he kept on the windowsill and poured me a cup without asking. "What are you going to do with it?" he said. He did not mean Haverstock. "Nothing active," I said. "I'm going to do exactly one thing, and then let everything else run its course." Which is, there's a scholar in Brussels whose intellectual work was directly appropriated. Her thesis is the source material. I'm going to contact her, share what I've documented, and leave the decision about what to do with it entirely in her hands. He turned the cup in his hands. When? When I'm at Haverstock and there's no institutional connection between me and Aldercroft that could complicate the framing. He nodded. "And the new manuscript?" he said. "If Delphine submits it and it goes through peer review, then the peer review panel will encounter the same problems I encountered, possibly independently, possibly because the scholar in Brussels has already filed documentation. Either way, I am not the mechanism. I am just someone who recognized a problem and gave the person it most directly harmed the tools to pursue it." Gideon looked out his window at the campus we had both been looking at for more than a decade. "The field will be better for it," he said. "Yes," I said, "eventually." I drove out of the Aldercroft faculty parking lot on my last official day as a member of their tenured staff and felt the particular lightness of having set down something that I had not fully understood was heavy. Haverstock was immediate. I use that word with precision. From the first week, the work was real, in the way that institutional academic work sometimes is and sometimes isn't. There are periods in a scholarly career when you are doing research and periods when you are managing a position, navigating administrative currents, attending meetings that produce other meetings, teaching courses that deserve more attention than the structure allows you to give them. I had spent years doing both, keeping the research alive in the cracks and margins of the administrative apparatus. At Haverstock, the apparatus was minimal. The project manager, Josephine, ran the administrative elements with a precision that had the quality of art, invisible when functioning, which is the highest form of administration. The colleagues, distributed across 3 continents and coordinating primarily through a well-designed shared platform. So we're serious people doing serious work. No reply-all email chains about holiday party logistics. No meetings called to discuss the outcome of the last meeting. Just the work. I worked from my study at home through the autumn. The lamp was on the desk. The altarpiece was on the wall. My books were in their order. I drafted the opening section of a paper I had been thinking about for 3 years. My first residency was in Brussels in October, at the Royal Library, working with a collection I had been in correspondence about for 18 months. Flemish devotional manuscripts from the 14th century, partially catalogued in the 1930s and not revisited since with modern methods. The 1930s catalog was interesting for what it missed as much as for what it captured. On the 10th day of the residency, I sent Helene Powells an email. I had been considering this contact since the summer, working through the question of how to approach it and what framing was honest and functional simultaneously. I wrote to her museum address, introducing myself as a researcher who had encountered her 2017 thesis through my postdoctoral archive and found it directly relevant to a collaborative archival project I was currently developing. I said I was in Brussels for a research residency and wondered if she would be available for a brief meeting to discuss a possible consultation arrangement. All of that was true. Both things were simultaneously true. She responded the following day. She said she still followed the field when she could, that she had occasionally thought about returning to academic publication, and that she would be glad to meet. We met at a cafe near the museum on a Thursday afternoon. She was exactly as I had remembered from the conference 11 years earlier. Small, direct, dark hair, close cut, with the quality of thinking carefully before she spoke. She was no longer the doctoral student presenting a chapter she was still building. She had finished the work. She had lived with it for years in a drawer. The specific quality of her stillness was of someone who had made peace with not being heard and was not entirely sure what to do with the possibility of that changing. We discussed the archival project for an hour. The conversation was genuine. Her thinking had continued even without a formal academic framework, and she had observations about the collection I was working with that I had not arrived at on my own. I took notes. Thus, I told her I could offer a formal acknowledgement of her consultation in the project's published outputs, and that there might be grounds for co-authorship on a specific component. She said she was interested. Toward the end of the coffee, I said carefully, "I've been reading the recent English language scholarship on the same period. There's a monograph by Delphine Casal, Les Pratiques Scripturales, that's been widely circulated. I wondered if you had encountered it." She frowned slightly. "I've heard the name. Someone mentioned it last year. The argument about atelier transmission?" "Yes," I said. "The argument about atelier transmission." She registered that the sentence was carrying more than its surface. "Is there something I should know?" she said. "Also, I think there are arguments in that book that originate in your thesis without acknowledgement," I said. "I have comparative documentation that I built independently before I left my previous institution for my own records. 32 specific instances in the second monograph alone. If you wanted to review it, the decision about what to do with it would be entirely yours. I have no institutional interest in the outcome. I'm at Haverstock now and have no ongoing affiliation with the institution that hired Kessel." Helene was still. The cafe was quiet around us, afternoon light coming in from the street, the smell of coffee and whatever they used to clean the floors. "How long ago did you build this documentation?" she said. "January and February of this year, months before my position ended." "You're saying the timestamps precede any, personal grievance. The timestamps are February 14th for the first formal record. My displacement was announced in May." Another pause. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I'll need to see it," she said. I sent her the file the following week. The full 70 pages with annotations, with timestamps on every component, the comparative analysis presented as clearly as I could make it. I included a covering note that laid out the provenance exactly. Built between January and April while I was employed at Aldercroft, stored in 4 independently time-stamped formats, shared with no institution and no other party before this transmission. I said I was available to discuss the documentation if she had questions. When I said the decision about how and whether to proceed was entirely hers, and that I respected whatever she chose. I went back to the manuscripts. Helene responded in November. She had reviewed the documentation. She had conducted her own analysis, which was more thorough than mine because she was working from the inside of her own argument and could identify the intellectual genealogy of specific ideas in ways I could not. What she found, she said, was extensive and systematic. She had consulted a lawyer. She was considering contacting the press. She had also, independently, been in contact with a scholar at Utrecht, I will call her Dr. Vanderberg, who had published an article in Dutch in 2011 and who had identified a separate potential overlap with Delphine's earlier work. The Belgian thread and the Dutch thread were converging before they even touched my documentation. I thanked Helene. I told her I was available to support her process in whatever form was useful, but that I would defer entirely to her judgment. I reiterated that I had not contacted any institution, any press, or any party other than her. She wrote back, "I understand. Thank you." That was November. I returned from Brussels to my study and my lamp and the paper I was writing. The work was what it was, and the rest would run its course. In December, I submitted the first section of the Haverstock Archive Project's preliminary findings. Josephine sent me a note saying the committee was pleased. I slept 8 hours that night. In January, I received a message from a journal colleague who mentioned, in the course of a conversation about a different matter entirely, that there was an ongoing review of a recent contributor's published work. She did not name the contributor. I said I imagined that was complicated for everyone involved. She said extraordinarily. We moved on. In February, Helene emailed. She had formally submitted her complaint to the editorial board of the press that held Delphine's original contract, along with the documentation. She had simultaneously notified the Université de Liège's Research Integrity Office. She and Dr. Vanderberg were coordinating. I filed the update in my notes document and went back to work. Gideon sent me a message in March. Adrian had been in a closed meeting with the provost for 4 hours. No details available. I noticed the department was quiet in the specific way that departments go quiet when something is being processed at a level above normal sightlines. What was happening, as I understood it through the converging threads, was this. The peer review process for Delphine's contracted manuscript had produced problems. Not because of anything I had done directly. I had not contacted the press, had not contacted the reviewers, had not seeded anything. Reviewers working independently, without access to Helene's formal complaint or my documentation, had encountered the same material I had encountered. This is what happens when a methodology built on source obscurity collides with a field that has been internationalizing. A decade ago, a Belgian dissertation in French by a scholar who had left the field would have been essentially invisible to an English-language press's review panel. In the present moment, with digital repositories accessible anywhere, with automatic translation tools improving every year, with a field of medieval studies that increasingly includes European scholars as standard members of review panels, that invisibility was a diminishing asset. The specific reviewer who identified the Powell's overlap I do not know by name. I imagine they were Belgian, or had done their doctorate at a Belgian institution, or happened to have been at the same conference I had attended in the autumn of my postdoc, listening to a young scholar present a chapter she had not yet finished. And I imagine they felt the same sensation I had felt on a Sunday afternoon in January. Something that fit slightly wrong, an argument that had the quality of a performance, rather than the quality of thought that had emerged from direct engagement with the primary material. The mechanism did not require me. I had simply moved it forward. In April, Gideon sent a longer message. An inquiry had been formally opened at Aldercroft. Source secondhand, the way all sources are in these situations, a colleague in the provost's office had mentioned it to someone who had mentioned it to Gideon. Delphine had not appeared for her Thursday seminar. Her door was closed. I thought about that closed door. I had closed my own office door 11 months earlier, put out the light, walked away. She was now behind hers. Well, no, and the circumstances of being behind a closed door were very different. I was in Edinburgh for my second residency when Gideon sent me 3 words in early May. She's been suspended. I was working with a collection at the National Library that I had been attempting to access for 6 years. Late medieval devotional manuscripts with a provenance history I had been tracking through secondary references for nearly a decade. The collection was extraordinary in the specific way that archival work can be extraordinary. Not spectacular, not dramatic, but deeply itself, the product of particular historical circumstances and particular human decisions across centuries, available now to a person with the patience to sit with it. I walked in the mornings before the library opened. Edinburgh in May has a quality of light I have not encountered anywhere else. Not the flat, overexposed light of Aldercroft's institutional hallway, not the golden autumn light of Brussels, but something colder and more precise, as if the city had been thought through rather than simply built. I read Gideon's message on a bench outside the library with a cup of tea. Then I went inside and worked on the manuscript for 6 hours without interruption. In June, he sent more. Formal investigation. Aldercroft Research Integrity Board. The press had suspended Delphine's book contract. 2 journals were initiating review of published articles. The investigation proceeded through the summer. I was not contacted by any party at Aldercroft. I was not a complainant. I was not a witness in any formal process. But my name did not appear in the Research Integrity Board records. My 3rd residency was in Leiden in July, working with a collection at the University Library that contained 3 manuscripts I had been in correspondence about for 2 years. The weather was changeable. 4 days of rain, and then light that had the quality of a room that had just been cleaned. Everything precise. The canal water reflecting the sky and the buildings with equal attention. I ate lunch in the square near the Peterskerk and worked afternoons in the reading room. In September, a year and 1 month after I had cleared my office at Aldercroft, Gideon sent a longer message. It was done. Termination. Effective end of month. Research misconduct, Category 3. The most serious classification in Aldercroft's formal framework. Although the press had formally withdrawn the book contract and was initiating retraction proceedings for the first book. 2 journals had published retraction notices for published articles. Delphine had tendered a resignation before the formal termination took effect, but the Research Integrity Board's findings stood in the institutional record and would not be expunged. Adrian's chair appointment, Gideon wrote, was under review. The provost's office had opened a process to examine the hiring procedures and due diligence practices that had preceded the Wyndham appointment. Specifically, the question of what scholarly review had been conducted on Delphine's record before the donation was accepted and the tenured line created. The Wyndham Foundation, he wrote, was not pleased. I sat with that message for a long time. I thought about the specific quality of institutional accountability, the way it moves. Not quickly, not dramatically, but eventually with a thoroughness that is itself a consequence of the slowness. The thoroughness is the trade-off for the delay. An institution that moves quickly on these things produces incomplete findings. An institution that takes its time produces a record that is difficult to appeal, difficult to litigate, difficult to overturn. I thought about Adrian in his meeting with the provost, with the round, careful eyes and the steepled fingers, trying to reconstruct a narrative of scholarly due diligence from materials that had never existed because the decision had been made on the basis of donor funding and institutional convenience rather than rigorous review. I wrote back to Gideon. I said, "Thank you. Oh, I hope the department finds a stable path forward," which I meant for the department's sake. The students there had done nothing wrong. The colleagues I had respected had done nothing wrong. The institution itself, as a structure that had existed before Adrian and would exist after him, deserved a stable path forward. These things are separable. Let me return to the documentation because the mechanics of it are the part that is actually useful, and usefulness is the point. What I did, specifically in sequence, is this. I identified the problem the first time I encountered it in January. I began documenting immediately, not in the margin of any copy Delphine would ever see, but in my own file. Precise comparative annotations, page and line, source and derivative, the exact nature of the intellectual dependency. And then I worked with the same methodological care I would bring to any question of attribution in my field. I used the following timestamping strategy, and the strategy was built around one specific principle. The record must predate any personal grievance by a margin that is clear and deniable. First timestamp, an email from my personal account, sent to my personal account on February 14th at 11:40 p.m. The attachment was the working document in PDF form. The subject line was specific, documentation, comparative analysis, Casal/Paulwell's working draft. The email sat in my sent folder, timestamped, readable, permanently accessible. Second timestamp, certified mail, sent to my own home address the same day. Priority, with tracking. I did not address it cleverly, I just sent it to myself. The post office added a timestamp to the sealed envelope that was independent of anything I could control or alter after the fact. The envelope, unopened, sat in my kitchen drawer from February onward. Third timestamp, upload to the cloud storage account I maintained on a server in Switzerland on February 15th. The account predated this document by 4 years. It was not a new account created specifically to hold this material. The upload metadata was logged by the server. Fourth timestamp, an encrypted copy on an external drive I had owned since 2018. 4 independent timestamped records, none of them on institutional servers, none of them created after my displacement, all of them predating any personal motive for retaliation by 3 to 4 months. None of these required institutional resources. None of them required anyone else's cooperation. None of them required me to announce what I was doing. I simply built the record as I built the argument simultaneously in parallel. I was also meticulous about the boundary between what I could legitimately possess and what I could not. Everything in my file was sourced from materials I personally owned or that were publicly accessible. Delphine's book. Purchased commercially, my copy, my annotations. Helene's thesis, downloaded through a public university repository, time-stamped to my postdoc years before any of this. My own comparative annotations, entirely my work, created from materials I had the right to possess. I did not take anything from institutional servers. I did not forward institutional emails to external accounts. I did not access anything I was not authorized to access. The documentation was clean, No overreach, no unauthorized access, no institutional entanglement. A precise record of what I had observed, stored in a way that made it durable and dateable, shared ultimately with the person who had the most direct standing to act on it. When I shared it with Helene, I shared it as a private researcher sharing materials with another private researcher. I made clear that the decision about how to use it was entirely hers. I did not suggest an outcome or a timeline. The decision to pursue was hers. The formal complaint was hers. The contact with Dr. Vanderberg was hers. The lawyer was hers. Everything that followed came from her action, not mine. This is not modesty. It is the mechanism. If I had filed the complaint directly, I would have been the disgruntled ex-employee with an obvious motive. Also, the documentation would have been evaluated through that lens no matter how carefully I had built it. Adrian's people would have had a convenient narrative. The Wyndham Foundation's lawyers would have had a convenient narrative. The investigation would have proceeded, if it proceeded at all, with a filter applied to my credibility that I could not remove regardless of the quality of my evidence. By giving the file to Helene, a third-party scholar with no Aldercroft affiliation and a direct, clear, documentable injury, I transformed the nature of the complaint. It was not a displaced employee's grievance. It was a Belgian researcher's intellectual property claim, backed by documentation from multiple independent sources, building into a pattern that the press, the journals, and ultimately the institution could not manage their way around. Some of the difference in how those two complaints would have been received is not a small difference. It is the difference between being taken seriously and being handled. I had spent enough years in faculty meetings to understand exactly how institutions handle people who complain directly. I chose not to be handled. I also want to say clearly, I did not take pleasure in Helene's having to do the work of pursuing this. The effort was hers. The standing to make the claim was hers because the injury was hers. If she had chosen, after reviewing the documentation, not to pursue it, if she had decided the cost was not worth it, or the timing was wrong, or she simply didn't want to re-enter a field she had left, I would have stored the file and continued to Haverstock and let Aldercroft carry the consequences of its own decisions. As that outcome was also possible, and I had accepted it, she chose to pursue it. I think it mattered to her not only as a question of recognition, but as the specific thing that intellectual theft is. The taking of your most careful thinking, stripped of your name, spoken in someone else's voice. The argument that Helene spent 3 years building in a doctoral thesis was, for years, circulating under someone else's name in a prominent English language book that received reviews and prizes and opened institutional doors. At least now it didn't. In the spring after the investigation concluded, I received a message from a graduate student who had been in my authentication seminar at Aldercroft. The seminar Delphine had restructured, and the students had found less rigorous. Her name was Petra, which suited her, precise and strong and not interested in softening her edges. She had been admitted to a doctoral program at Edinburgh. She wrote to ask if I would serve on her supervisory committee. I wrote back the same day. I said I would be glad to. Her research area was transmission and attribution in late medieval manuscript culture. She said, "I'm working on the conditions under which attribution fails, not accidentally, but systematically. The structures that allow misattribution to persist. I thought of you because you're the one who taught me that the most important thing about a text is not what it says, but how it moves, who carries it, and where, and whether the carrying is acknowledged." I read that message twice. Then I wrote, "That's a good research question. Let's talk about how to frame it." We had a call the following week. She had found the special issue of the French journal that had published both my paper and Helene's piece. She had followed the footnotes. She said, "Careful and exact. This work corrects something, doesn't it? Not just in the scholarship, but in the record." "That's what attribution does," I said, "when it works." "How do you make sure it works?" I thought about the February envelope in my kitchen drawer, the Swiss server, the 70 pages. "You document," I said, "as you go, not after." She wrote that down. I could hear the pen. "And then," she said, "then you wait for the right moment and the right person. You don't have to be the person who acts. You have to be the person who has the record when the right person needs it." She was quiet for a moment. How do you know when to give it to them? You'll know, I said. It usually comes from paying attention to who the injury actually belongs to. We talked through her research framing for another hour. Before we ended, she said, "The Pauwell's piece in the journal. She hadn't published anything since her thesis, had she?" "No." "What brought her back?" I thought about this. Someone gave her the tools to understand that her work was still readable, I said. That it had been read and recognized, and that there was documentation of that recognition existing before the recognition was convenient or remunerative for anyone. Petra was quiet. "That's a different kind of attribution," she said finally. "Yes," I said. I finished the paper I had been writing and submitted it in November to the French journal that had reached out through Hélène. Soon it was 32 pages on the transmission of scribal practice across the Flemish-French border in the 14th century, built on archival work from the Brussels residency and 3 years of my own thinking, sourced precisely and acknowledged fully. Every intellectual debt identified, every borrowed argument attributed, the whole apparatus of citation functioning the way it is designed to function, as a record of who thought what and in what order. The issue published the following spring. It included Hélène's paper and mine and 4 other contributions from scholars across Europe. The introduction noted in careful academic language that the field was in a period of increased attention to questions of attribution and scholarly lineage. That sentence was doing considerable work for readers who knew how to read it. I sent Hélène a note when the issue appeared. She wrote back within an hour. She said it was good to be publishing again. She said she was thinking about a book. The thesis, revisited with a decade's additional perspective, properly extended, ready for a press that would put her name on the cover and keep it there. I said, "I think you should write it." She said, "I think I will." I drove past Aldercroft once that spring, on the way to a library consortium meeting in the city. Not deliberately. It was the most direct route, and I was in a car rather than on the train, and there it was through the windshield. Briefly, the parking structure that blocked the view of the river, the oak tree in full leaf outside the History Building, the building where my office had been looking exactly as it always had from the outside. Oh, I slowed in traffic for a moment. Then the light changed and I drove on. There was nothing there that I needed. The paper was in print. The Edinburgh student was deep into her first chapter. The Haverstock Archive project was approaching its first major public release. My study had the lamp from my mother and the photograph of the Ghent altarpiece, and 3 years of work that I had built without compromise, without theft, and without anyone's permission. I thought briefly about Adrian in the provost's office, about the Wyndham Foundation's lawyers reviewing the hiring process, about the specific quality of silence that descends on an administration that has to account for decisions it made with confidence and without rigor. I had made him no promises and asked him for nothing. I had simply left. The rest had taken care of itself. There is a thing that happens with manuscripts later identified as forgeries. A retroactive rereading, where every element you once found impressive reveals itself as effort rather than authenticity, the over-perfect vellum, the too consistent hand, the argument that is brilliant in the way of a performance rather than brilliant in the way of thought that emerged from direct, sustained engagement with actual material. You start to see the strain. I had seen it in Delphine's work the first time I read it carefully, in the footnotes that pointed away from the actual source, in the formulations that were almost right, but didn't carry the organic quality of thinking that had grown from inside the problem. A scholar who has built their own argument knows what their own thinking sounds like. When you are reading borrowed thinking, that there is a texture difference, a quality of fit that isn't quite right. The way a coat altered for someone else never hangs with quite the right ease on your body. I had spent 30 years learning to read that difference. The certified mail envelope is still in my kitchen drawer, postmarked February 14th, sealed, unopened. I have no practical reason to open it. I know what it says. It has served its purpose simply by existing. A permanent, sealed, independently dated record of what I knew and when I knew it, which could have been produced at any point in the preceding 2 years to establish the sequence of events clearly and without ambiguity. But I keep it there because I find something specifically correct about its presence. The past is readable. The record is intact. The sequence is datable and clear. That is what you build. But when you do this right, not a weapon, not a threat, not a strategic instrument waiting to be deployed, you build a record. You build it because the future is opaque, and you want the past to be clear. You build it as you go, before anything has happened that could contaminate the purpose of building it. You build it from materials you own, in accounts you control, with timestamps that are independent of any institution's systems. You keep your boundary clean. What is yours? What is public? What is the institution's? You never cross the line on that. The cleanliness of the record is its strength. And then you wait for the person to whom the injury most directly belongs. You give them what you have. You leave the decision to them. What you build in the meantime is yours. The work, the record, the paper published in a French journal, or the dissertation chapter that your Edinburgh student is writing in a city where the morning light is cold and precise and exactly what you need to think. The lamp from your mother on the desk. The photograph of the altarpiece on the wall, slightly too warm in the reproduction, carrying inside it a morning in Ghent when you were 30, and the work felt impossible and magnificent simultaneously, and you did not know yet what you were building, but you were building it. It came with you. That is the whole of it. The door closed, the light was off, the record was intact.